Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's episode of Hey Sister. Hey, sister, how you doing?
Hey, sister, I am doing wonderful because I'm being joined by a Southernite tonight.
Well, we got time to introduce your fellow Southern Night. We got another Mister with us this evening, so welcome, Mr. Donney Rose, to Hey Sister.
Hey, thank you all for having me.
We're so excited to have you. My sister's been talking about you for a while. We got one of our super fans, Cam, is already tuned in. So hey,
Hey,
Cam, how you
Cam.
doing? If you are watching tonight, if you would go ahead, like, follow, share, subscribe, let everybody know that Hey Sister is now live, and then invite them to join you and join the conversation in the comments. That's where all the action happens, in the comments. And really, we love having great dialogue, not just with one another, but with our fantastic guests that we have. And so Donnie's going to introduce himself in a little bit, but in typical Hey Sister fashion, hey Mary Dennis, how you doing?
Hi, Miss
She's
Murray.
tuning in tonight as well. In typical Hey Sister fashion, we're going to start off this evening with a couple of hot topics. Um, the first hot topic, it's not really a hot topic. It's really very devastating news. In that this weekend we learned of the death of Regina King's son, Ian Alexander Jr. And we learned that he died by suicide. So the first thing we want to say is that if anyone, I'm putting the suicide prevention lifeline number website across the bottom of the screen here. If anybody that you know is struggling or having dark thoughts, um, get help. Um, we have had two men on this show on Hey Sister, and when we've had conversations, they talked about getting into the place where their thoughts went to suicidal ideation. And so it is real, and there's no turning back. And so if you're struggling, if you know someone who's struggling, if you care about folks, get help. And so here's the website, here's the phone number. But sister, what were you thinking when you heard this news?
I was devastated. Obviously, like everyone, I am a huge fan of Regina King. And I just had this moment where I thought to myself, what could have been so bad? And I know people go through all sorts of pain. Some that's physical, some that's not physically you're able to see, but just deeply emotional and being tormented inside. But it's like for me, I immediately felt like suicide is such a permanent decision for something that could be a temporary problem if you just have the right you know support system. And I know that his mother would give anything to have been able to offer him that support. And I guess I feel like, she probably didn't even know. And that's the struggle for parents, right? When they don't have, when they don't know, so then they can't necessarily help. So my heart breaks for her as being that that's the only child she's brought into this world. So, yeah, it's very devastating news. But I pray that the young man, his soul, his spirit, is at rest, and that he has found a place of peace.
Okay. Donnie, do you have any thoughts, or what were you thinking when you heard this news?
A few things. So one of the first things that I really paid attention to was how much Ian favored Regina King. He practically had her face, and how haunting that will be for her, for the rest of her days. That her only child, who basically bared her face, that she may feel like she was not able to do what she needed to do to save him. I also thought about the fact that this young man died by suicide 2 days after his birthday, and what amount of anguish and turmoil he must have been in at that point. And I was thinking about the press release or the press statement that was put out, and it was very brief. And Regina King talked about how Ian was someone who cared so deeply about other people, and that struck me because it made me really think about that. Oftentimes, folks who are crying out the most are pouring the most into other people. And
Mhm.
part of the ways that folks often cry out silently is by how much they pour into other people. And I think the last thing I thought about, so a few years ago, I was on a panel in Baton Rouge that spoke about the numbers, the escalated numbers of black men in East Baton Rouge Parish that had died by suicide. And the number was staggering. It was like an explosive uptick in percentage from, I want to say, 2017 to 2019. And what happens a lot, particularly for black men, is like this crippling patriarchy that keeps us from being vulnerable in how we're feeling, that often keeps us from, you know, seeking help, that often like we demonize ourselves whenever we feel like there is something not right, with with us mentally, or there's something that's not right with us emotionally. And without knowing any of the details of Ian Alexander's what led him there, I couldn't help but think if there was a point where this young man was feeling kind of trapped by patriarchy, or feeling trapped by this idea that as a man, he could not, convey his vulnerabilities, and how, a lot of brothers have left this earth based on feeling crippled by this level of, masculinity, or this level of patriarchy that often deprives us from being able to be vulnerable with where we are, at any given time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to their family, we send our sincere condolences. We don't know you from anyone else, but we have lifted you up in prayer, and we'll pray for that peace and the healing that only comes from, as our friend said, from kind of doing the work of working through it, because time doesn't heal anything. It's really going to be the working through it. So for all of you out there, if you know someone who is struggling, here's the suicide prevention hotline, the phone number. Share the number, share the website, and get help, whether it's for yourself or for a loved one. And so, um, on a lighter note, much lighter note, big term, because it's a heavy, that's a heavy topic to come off of. But our next hot topic is Janet Jackson. She is premiering her own documentary that she's done, um, on Lifetime, this starting on this Friday. And so, sister,
Mhm.
what are you thinking about one Miss Jackson if you're nasty?
I'm excited. I am looking forward to seeing this documentary, especially about discussing about the halftime and her feelings about that after these many years, especially now since everybody naked everywhere. So I don't know. Clearly, that was an overreaction, but but yeah, I'm really excited. I'm excited to see her speak for herself and just stand in her own power in this moment. Now I gotta say I'm happy it's a documentary on Lifetime, because if it would have been something that they fictionalized, there was gonna be some bad casting and some bad wigs. So happy Miss Janet is telling it with her own footage and telling her own story. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah. Well, Donnie, I don't know. Are you a Janet Jackson fan? I know you're of the age and the generation of young men who probably grew up with that. What's that? That's when she, what's the song?
Pleasure principle.
Yeah.
Not no, after Pleasure Principle.
Maybe anytime, any place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of us felt very mannish at that point. Um, I wouldn't necessarily say that I am, a Janet Jackson fan per se, but I do, I appreciate what she's contributed to music and to dance and to style and fashion. I mean, the Jackson family in general are American musical icons, right? And so anything that comes out about them is going to be of interest. And I think with Janet, what's interesting for me about Janet is that she is so reclusive. In an age of celebrities like, having Instagrams and being, us having access, Janet has never necessarily given the public a wide amount of access. And so I think that within itself will make her documentary that much more compelling because we probably have a lot of questions about Janet. Like Janet became a mother a few years ago, like at 50 years old, right? And so there's a lot of things to to dig into that we just don't know. And so I think if nothing else, that would make it interesting. It's funny that you said, Demetri, about like it not being, or maybe that was you, Christina's, about not being like a Lifetime original. Because I saw something where Keisha Knight Pulliam was like, I couldn't have played Janet in the Lifetime movie. Like, well, there's probably a few reasons why you could, because y'all look nothing alike. But it's Lifetime. Like Lifetime could have very well gotten, I don't know, Carlton Banks to play Janet Jackson. So we should all be so lucky that it's just a documentary.
Yes, absolutely. Well, if you're looking forward to it, drop in the comments what you're most looking forward to learning more about or hearing from Janet in her own voice. And I do believe that there is something about women turning 50 that the fourth decade is most definitely liberating, but I know for all my friends out there who have reached the fifth decade, they definitely say, oh no, all I'm taking back. I'm taking back my story for real. When she was singing about control in those days, she really still didn't fully have that control, right? And
Mhm.
so there's definitely something liberating, and I am looking forward to seeing and learning more about her side of the story. So
Miss Jackson, if you're nasty.
yeah. So speaking of stories, Mr. Donnie Rose. So
Mhm.
you're an artist, you're an activist, you started out in the spoken word world. Why don't you tell us your story and tell us who you are and a little bit about your story and how you got into the work that you do?
So I am a native of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, born and bred, and a current resident of Hyattsville, Maryland. My wife and I relocated to Hyattsville in October of 2020, right in the thick of the pandemic. Um, we were looking for a change of pace. Some of this had to do with the fact that 2 years prior to that, in 2018, I got a fellowship through the Kennedy Center, which allowed me to spend time in DC a couple of times back and forth. So just kind of throughout that process, I kind of had my eye on the area, and I knew that as much as I love and was endeared to the Baton Rouge community, that there was always a possibility that I may, eventually depart. My wife is a native of New Jersey, and so the whole time that she lived in, she went to Louisiana to go to school at Xavier, to make sure your alma mater. Um, and she stayed in Louisiana for over a decade after that. This is where we end up meeting, in Baton Rouge, and she always kind of had a deep desire to return to the East Coast. Um, I had an interest in seeing something else, so we met somewhere in the middle, and moved to the Upper South, that is Maryland. So we've been here since October 2020. But before that time, I'm the son of a school teacher and a plant worker. I'm the youngest of two, youngest of three, uh, grew up in predominantly black neighborhoods, grew up in a black church, educated, through, in black schools, went to Southern University. Uh, as you mentioned about my life as an artist, I started performing poetry, spoken word poetry, when I was a student at Southern University. And the thing that I often like say about that is at the time that I started performing poetry, I did not necessarily have a campus identity. So I did not belong to I wasn't in the band, I wasn't a Greek, I was an SGA. Like I was just kind of a dude, roaming around the campus that had something of a knack for writing. Um, and I found the campus poetry reading by happenstance. Um, and once I went in there, I was like, okay, this is my tribe. Like I found my people. Prior to that, I wrote a lot of raps when I was in high school and would pass around a composition book with friends, but I didn't take my creative writing too seriously until I found the Wednesday night poetry reading rather at Southern University in the famed Mocha Room in the Smith and Brown Memorial Union. Um, and what that kind of morphed into was me eventually going out to open mics in the Baton Rouge area, the grown folks clubs, um, and meeting community and meeting folks and basically gaining access to a community of people that I never knew existed in Baton Rouge. Um, it was there where I was meeting, Rastafarians and meeting, folks who may have been atheists and meeting folks who were in the LGBTQ plus community or whatever. It was a whole different world that opened up for me, even though I had lived in Baton Rouge my whole life. So, fast forwarding from there, I started to compete at national poetry slams. And then in 2005, a lady by the name of Anna West, who was a native of Baton Rouge, who had lived in Chicago, returned to Baton Rouge to start a creative writing program in schools called Wordplay. And I was one of the poets that was recommended to her to train to be a teaching artist, which is basically going into classrooms, teaching curriculum, spoken word poetry curriculum, and trying to engage young people in creative writing. So I began doing that work in 2007, and it was more or less the defining element of my life because leading up to that point, I graduated college in 2003, and between 2003 and 2007, I was kind of the king of the odd job. I worked in a lot of call centers. Um, I just did things that were not purpose driven. I was a substitute teacher, and a lot of that came to me naturally because my mother was a school teacher. But I knew that I wanted to really be able to infuse the art that I fell in love with in a more substantive way. And so becoming a teaching artist gave me the opportunity to do that. So I did that work for a few years, originally under a program in Baton Rouge called the Big Buddy Program. In 2012, myself and my friend slash fellow teaching artist branched out and started a nonprofit called Forward Arts, along with a bunch of other people. And we continued that work up to 2018. And as the cycle of nonprofits go, we unfortunately were not able to retain or sustain, our organization. But we had, a solid 7 years in. So after that point in 2019, I kind of just existed as an independent contractor, as a writer, as a performer. I did some communication work for another nonprofit in town. I did some, gigs here and there for arts organizations or for colleges in and outside the state. And at that point, I also was working on the most impactful project that I ever did called the American Audit. So, and I'll get into that a little more later. Just trying to move through the timeline. Fast forward to 2020, I debuted that project, the American Audit, exactly 2.5 weeks before lockdown. Um, and then, COVID and the pandemic shifted, my world as well as everyone else's. And it was during that time where my wife and I had several conversations about what does it look like to possibly just uproot and relocate. And we landed on coming to Southern Maryland, Hyattsville again, because as I mentioned, I had some time in DC through my Kennedy Center Fellowship, so I became somewhat acclimated to the area. And I think what it ultimately came down to for us, aside from a desire of wanting to relocate, was that we were living in such uncertain times with the pandemic. Then what was it to jump into additional uncertainty? So, you know, why not leave? And actually, a lot of people, there were studies that showed that a lot of people relocated during the time of pandemic. And I think it was based around the same idea of if we're living in a time of isolation and in a time of uncertainty, then what difference does it really make to jump into the unknown? Like the whole world was living the unknown. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of I guess where the story comes up to present. For the past 15 months, been a resident of Hyattsville, Maryland, which is in PG County, a historically affluent Black county in the DMV area, 3 miles away from DC. Have been able to explore the area a bit, and yeah, that's pretty much I guess my story in a nutshell.
Well, thank you for sharing. I mean, we got a little bit of your story. We got into the art, but I know one of the reasons we didn't touch on then the activism piece and how
Yeah,
you've been using your voice and using the pen to really speak truth to power.
yeah,
And you got to tell us all where to follow you so we can put all
yeah.
of up there for everybody to see. But how you've also used your art to
Mhm.
really kind of express, be the voice of the voiceless. Tell us a little bit more about that in the activism
Yeah,
piece.
yeah.
Well,
So,
wait, before you jump into that, I just wanted to say something because I said I would talk about it on Hey Sisters. So, I first heard about you from Drag Muse, as I
I was
mentioned
Drac.
on Facebook,
Yeah, it's my
and Drag and I have partnered on a mini homecoming, Southern University homecoming parties over the
mm,
last few years. And every time we get ready to have a party, first of all, the hot venue is a new venue. It's always a changing venue.
yes, yes, yes.
Obviously, there's very few, if any, like Black owned
Right.
venues.
Yeah.
Even when there are Black folks who maybe manage it or have a special night, and we would find ourselves running into that conundrum every year, and then feeling like, man, we would love to create something where it's not just us coming and having a good time, but just feels like, how do we give back to the Southern University community? How do we give back to the Black community? Because there's a very different, like I tell people all the time, Baton Rouge and New Orleans are very different. It's a very different sense when you're there. And even though we're in the city, pouring money into the city, very often it's a feeling like you're not wanted,
Hmm.
especially in like the downtown venues. And so we just happened to be having one of these conversations as we were leading up to a homecoming. And he was just mentioning some of the folks that were there. And I think this was around the whole, if you remember, the John Delgado was owning the place in downtown Baton Rouge, and we had planned to go there, and then he started acting a fool, and so that's when he first told me about Donney Rose, and so I think you may have written about it in the Rouge Collective,
Yeah,
Rouge Collection, if I remember, and I
yeah,
was like, yep, these are my people right here
yeah,
because
yeah,
yeah, that John Juan Delgado was acting a fool.
yeah,
But
yeah.
so that's how I found out about you. So now you can take it from there with the
Okay,
acting.
I will. That's a part of the story that I will get into in talking about this. Right. So, let me backtrack and say this and kind of lead into that. So when I first started going to National Poetry Slam events, um, the majority of the participants, I first started going in the early 2000s, and it first really kicked off in '96. The majority of the participants were primarily white. Um, so much so that there would be side events at the National Poetry Slam events, such as the African American Open Mic or the Hispanic American Open Mic or the, insert other marginalized group open mic, right? Because even in this democratic space, quote unquote, and I don't mean democratic as capital D, small d, right, of performance poetry, it was still as, a microcosm of America, where, white folks were primarily the organizers and a lot of the large number of participants. So when I first started going to National Poetry Slams, the idea was to write quote unquote universal poems. Because with a poetry slam, your poems are being scored as a competition. So you're trying to gain as much favor with randomly selected judges as you possibly can. And so the MO for a lot of Black poets back then was write poems that are universal or that have a universal appeal, right? And so I will say that very early on, a lot of my art I compromise
Mm-hmm.
for the purpose of universality, right? Um, Around 2012, or 2000, I'll say around 2012, the cultural conversation began to shift. So February 2012 is, unfortunately, when Brother Trayvon Martin was taken by way of, George Zimmerman's cowardice and murder, right? And I remember that summer, because the National Poetry Slam would take place in the summer, that the temperament amongst Black poets was kind of changing. By 2013, there are other incidents of either racialized or police violence, such as, Jordan Davis, who was also killed in Florida. And by the time we got to 2014, you had Eric Garner, you had Michael Brown. And so what was happening amongst a lot of Black poets, written and spoken word poets, was this kind of surging of Black Lives Matter era writing, um, where we kind of were like, we're not concerned about trying to write things with universal themes. Like our people are dying, and like lynchings were taking place in broad daylight and being recorded. And so it would have been disingenuous of the poets in the poetry slam community and beyond that community to sit around, performing poems about, general ideas such as, I don't know, anxiety, right? And it's not that, we weren't experiencing anxiety, but to not focus or to try to like kind of have a direct lens on what was going on would have been, disrespecting, the words of Nina Simone that talked about how artists are supposed to reflect the times. And so for me, I got immersed in that type of writing. And, through my immersion in that type of writing, poetically, I also just started to talk about these things just like on Facebook and just kind of in my regular, conversation. So I was going through my own kind of period of personal evolution. This was also at a time where I was going through an extreme battle with my health that culminated in a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis at the end of 2014. So I kind of was like, I don't know, what my life is about to be or what I do or do not have to lose, but I'm not about to sit here holding my tongue about what is going on in the world around me. So fast forward to 2016, which was the most pivotal point for me, I guess, in my, activism life, if you want to call it that. At the beginning of 2016, there was a Mardi Gras parade in a neighborhood called Spanish Town. And in that parade, there was a float of a flamingo being hit upside the head with a baton. It was a painting of a flamingo being hit upside the head with a baton by a police officer. And on the side of the float, it said "Pink Lives Matter." Right. There was another float of a flamingo, which is the mascot of the Spanish Town Parade, um, being choked. Also, "Pink Lives Matter." And so I'm looking at this very popular. This is like the most popular Mardi Gras parade in Baton Rouge, and my hometown is trivializing a national phenomenon of black folks being killed by the state. That was strike one. Strike two came a couple of months later, April of that year, where a young man, I believe his name is Jacoby Davis, was attending an Earth Day event in downtown Baton Rouge and was assaulted by a number of police. Um, the story was that a fight broke out, and he was one of the last people remaining, and he got assaulted by a number of police. One of those police that were on the scene was a guy that we would come to later know by the name of Blaine Solomon. Blaine Solomon, in July of 2016, was the trigger man who killed Alton Sterling outside of Triple S. And so when that happened, all of the things that I had been talking about or reading about or writing about prior to that literally landed in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
So the summer of 2016 was like the most tumultuous period of my life, like ever in Baton Rouge, because what was happening was, a lot of people were organizing, and advocating on behalf of Alton Sterling. And I was doing a lot of writing on social media that was traveling about and moving around. And it was like this marathon of people in my inbox asking me about my well being, or family members concerned, or people asking me what's the next move. And I'm meeting other organizers and meeting other activists in town again that I didn't even know were there, right? But we all kind of mobilized around this moment. And, city leaders and public officials were looking to a few people, myself included, to try to speak to the community and try to manage the temperament. But we were combustion waiting to happen. And so, as the story of summer 2016 goes, Alton Sterling is killed on July 5th. A couple of days later, a huge rally takes place in downtown Baton Rouge. After that rally happens, all hell breaks loose. People are assaulted. The street that I live on is rolled on with a military tank. It is it's chaos. A week and a half after that, a vigilante comes into town and shoots 5 Baton Rouge police officers and kills 3 of them. So we're just in this extreme thick of just chaos, right? Fast forward, a month and a half after that, well, a little over a month after that, 1,000-year historic flood hits Baton Rouge.
Mm-hmm.
So we are enduring roughly 45 days of blood and flood, right? Where things are just like wildly chaotic. And throughout all this time, I'm using my voice and I'm writing about these things and I'm talking about these things and I'm attending community meetings. I'm also dealing with the personal grief of one of the young people that I worked with, one of my students, tragically passing away unexpectedly, like while all of this is going on. And so, you know, the first year, that 2016 was the first year that I got a community award in Baton Rouge. A theater company named the New Venture Theater Company gave me a Humanitarian of the Year award that year. And it was really more or less predicated on the conversations I was having publicly and, how I was, using my art and, using my voice and, mobilizing with other organizers on the ground. So 2017 rolls around, and this is where I'm gonna get into what Christina just referenced. So 2017 rolls around, and we are on the back end of all of this just immense turmoil in 2016. Um, we have a new mayor, Sharon Weston Broom, who's the first Black woman to be elected mayor of Baton Rouge. She won office at the end of 2016 and took office at the top of 2017. So one of the things that Mayor Broome was looking to do was take this initiative called Brave, which was essentially, I forgot what the acronym was for, but it essentially kind of operated as a sting operation to kind of entrap drug dealers. And she wanted to reallocate the funding for that to bring in people from the community to do preventative work with young people in the poor zip codes in Baton Rouge. The previous mayor was used to hire like a bunch of like white businesses and white organizations to come in and take a lion's share of Brave money to basically do nothing preventative. So the new mayor was like, I'm gonna bring in different people to do, things that they do well to, mobilize young people in these poor zip codes. So one of the recipients of the new Brave contract was myself and two of my friends in the organization we worked for. We were paid like $7,000 to do workshops at a library in two of the poor zip codes in Baton Rouge. So fast forward, there was a Metro Council meeting where a guy who goes by the name Silky Slim made a comment about what took place in 2016 with the police officers that were killed. He basically said, if you did not have Alton Sterling being slaughtered, you would not have had Gavin Long coming into Baton Rouge, like cause and effect, right? So there was nothing incorrect about it. Gary Chambers made a post about that particular incident, and I commented on Gary Chambers' post, essentially like, Silky Slim is correct. If you did not have that cause, you didn't, I wasn't condoning police being killed, but like it was a matter of cause and effect. If you never have Alton Sterling shooting, unfortunately, you never have Gavin Long coming into town. So John Delgado got wind of that comment, and he made his own post where he basically was like, Donney Rose believes that, he made a post where he said something about, Mayor Broome is paying Donney Rose $7,000 to teach poetry to young gangbangers, and he believes that, the police shooting was justified. So it got completely blown out of context, right? What happened after that was the wildest thing ever, where a bunch of people in my community just rode on John Delgado. Like they came down like a hawk and they rode on him. And the thing was, John Delgado, he had a reputation in town, of being a club owner that had venues with very strict dress codes that were very, they were racially charged as far as the dress code. He also ran for mayor that year, and he lost to Sharon Weston Broome. So there was a lot of like undertones. Long story short, as far as that's concerned, for about 2 days, John Delgado's Facebook was being flooded with people serving as character references for me and the people who I rode with. He didn't know who I was. In fact, Gary Chambers told me a story where John Delgado called him and was like, who is this Donney Rose? And Gary was like, I think you barked up the wrong tree, right? So, long story short, about a week after all of that took place, John Delgado and I met one-on-one. And, I basically was like, you look to defame me and you look to put me in harm's way. Because there were people, floating images of nooses around on social media, people from his side, like, this is what you do with folks like that. I was like, you put me in harm's way behind a statement that you misconstrued. And so we had like an hour discussion at a coffee shop. And at the end of that discussion, John Delgado more or less retracted his statement and made a public post on Facebook saying that I was a fine, upstanding man and that I should be given the funding that the mayor's office is going to give me. And so that's when people were like, oh, you the GOAT. You had John Delgado walk back, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, whatever. I'm just trying to set the record straight. And really, the people who did me the most justice in that moment was my community. Later that year, I received the Baton Rouge Business Report 40 Under 40 Award, which I think, yeah, I had been doing my thing in the community as far as, an organizer and a teaching artist, but I would be remiss to say that that moment did not up my profile with the people of Baton Rouge Business Report that were paying attention to that, right? Because
Yeah.
and I'll say this before I wrap up with that, because with 40 Under 40, traditionally there's only about a 5% minority recipient every year in Baton Rouge. And so I was more or less a hot topic in 2017. And it wasn't so much what I did as much as it was John Delgado's retraction of what I did that I think, caught the attention of the business report people where they were like, well, this guy must be something of something. So, yeah.
Okay.
That-
Well, sister, I know, well, first I was going to say, we got some crazy comment. So I guess that might be because Donney Rose is the man here. But so you brought up your friend Gary Chambers.
Yeah.
I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about Gary Chambers. So, sister, you want to roll the video or?
Yes, let me do that. But first, I got Donnie's website here scrolling across the bottom. So you all make sure you go get his website, look at some of his writings, and check out some of the projects and things that he's worked on. And so let me pull up the video.
And it should be the first.
Yeah, I have it. So Gary Chambers, you all probably remember when he talked about Carol at the school board, and he
Connie,
not Carol. Carol, Karen, Connie, whoever. Connie over there on her computer.
Yeah.
He ran for Congress recently. But that district is those boundaries are so wackadoodle. That Troy Carter, I don't know how it covers Baton Rouge and New Orleans, but nonetheless, we know how they do with the gerrymandering of congressional districts. But one Gary Chambers is also running again for the Senate against Mr. Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
And so Gary has made the news because of this ad in which he is smoking a blunt. So we're going to play that ad for you.
You have the sound up.
Oh. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on, y'all. I couldn't even find my mute button over here. Hold on.
Every 37 seconds, someone is arrested for possession of marijuana. Since 2010, state and local police have arrested an estimated 7.3 million Americans for violating marijuana laws, over half of all drug arrests. Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana laws than white people. States waste $3.7 billion enforcing marijuana laws every year. Most of the people police are arresting aren't dealers, but rather people with small amounts of pot, just like me. I'm Gary Chambers, and I'm running for the U.S. Senate, and I approve this message.
All right. Well, we know that Gary doesn't shy away from controversy in any way, shape, or form. And actually, this ad has been the talk of much of the national media as well, and even Mr. Bill Maher talked about it and commented on his show about it as well. So Gary's a friend of yours. He's running for Senate. What was your take?
So I saw that video the morning he posted it, right before it kind of started to make its rounds. I'm never surprised by Gary's boldness. I will say that. But what I thought when I saw that video is like, this is ingenious, because what he did was he weaponized his own casual usage in a way that John Kennedy could not use that against him, right? So let's just say, hypothetically, John Kennedy would have found out in a roundabout way that Gary Chambers occasionally smokes pot. Well, Gary Chambers has already put that out there. So what could John Kennedy say? That this guy who's running for Senate is a weed head, he's a pothead, he's a marijuana enthusiast, whatever. He's literally telling you, this is something that I do recreationally, but it's a larger point here, which is this idea that every 37 seconds somebody is, arrested for marijuana possession. He talks about how $3.7 billion had been wasted over the past decade or so on, trumped up marijuana charges. He talks about, how these numbers have impacted 7.3 million Americans. And the brilliant thing about it is at the end, he's talking about the people who have been disproportionately arrested, i.e. Black folks, for having a, small amount of pot are not dealers. They are recreational users just like me. Mm-hmm. So when I went back
also not in participants because of those arrests in the multi-million-dollar business
right, exactly,
that is
right.
the legalized marijuana business.
So I'm a go read the comments type guy, and so when he posted the video on his Instagram, I went back to the comments a couple of hours later, and it was just a flood of people like, yes, thank you. Where's your link to donate? I'm about to send you a campaign donation. Exactly. We need to, decriminalize marijuana. We need to normalize, so it was just a flood of that. And of course, there were people, saying, this is the wrong message and you shouldn't be saying this, or they're going to use this against you at a later time. But what Gary, what Gary understands, what I know he understands, is that in Louisiana, and you all know this as natives, the political arena is a bit of a circus, right? We are known for sensationalized campaign ads. We're known for people attacking each other. We're known for just like ridiculous levels, The guy, John Kennedy, said in an ad like last year that before he would ever betray Louisianans, he would drink weed killer, right? So this is the level of like ridiculousness that politics in Louisiana often devolve to. And so the thing that people should kind of understand about Gary in this situation, last year he ran for ran in the special election for Congress once Cedric Richmond, went up to the Biden administration and he lost to Troy Carter. Mm-hmm. Like the year before that, he ran for Louisiana State Senate in the district and lost to Regina Barrow. So Gary is at a point, I think, in his political career and his aspirations to where he's like, I played it straight and narrow 2 years in a row. And I'm trying to kick facts and I'm trying to like speak truth to power in a place that is really all about the circus and about political theater. So let me give you an act. And so what happened, in response to that, is that within a matter of 2 days, he's on like 4 or 5 different networks. He's on CNN. He's on MSNBC a couple of times. Stephen Colbert mentions it. Like it goes viral, right? The second time he has something go viral in that capacity after the County Bernard School Board thing, right? And so what I think that he understood, or what he's understanding in this moment, is that if you're going to have a fighting chance in Louisiana, as a Black man, as a progressive, as someone who has, a background as an activist, you cannot play it too close to the chest.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to take the reins on what people may eventually try to use against you and put it at the forefront. It's kind of like, I don't know if you ever saw the movie 8 Mile, but at the end of 8 Mile, Eminem is in a rap battle and Eminem starts the rap battle where he's insulting himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he insults himself for the first 30 seconds of the battle. And with that, he completely disarms the person that he's battling against. Because everything that the person would have said, now he can no longer use. And I think that was a similar tactic, deployed there, where Gary is like, if you're going to say, if you're going to eventually say that I support the decriminalization of marijuana, well, look, I'm about to sit here in an open field smoking a blunt to show you that. And what I noticed after that, and what he has done, is said, I smoked a blunt in my campaign ad in order to open up conversations, not just about decriminalizing marijuana, but other things. And now that I have your attention, CNN, MSNBC, et cetera, you're going to invite me on your platforms, and I'm going to tell you about my whole agenda.
Yeah, and then, the thing is, I mean, look, we keep up with home, and Senator John Kennedy, I'm not even going to try to mince words. He has been a bit of an embarrassment, if you ask me. I don't know what his purpose has been in the Senate at all, other than to be an obstructionist like the others in his party. But I don't see what his real purpose is. And it's unfortunate that's not enough, right? It's unfortunate that is not enough reason to vote for anybody who just has one or two trains of thought that connect.
Well, John Kennedy was one of the few senators who voted against decertifying the presidential election. Mm-hmm. So he was like one of those. This election was fake, right?
Right.
But the thing to consider, and what Gary is really fighting against, is just the old guard of Louisiana politics, because the reality of the situation is that John Kennedy has secured, I think, around $15 million in his currently in his bid for re-election, and that is because
that
Louisiana.
So
and that is because our home state is mired with a bunch of people that are interested in good old boy politics and keeping, retaining the status quo. In a place like, Louisiana, if folks are able to, secure certain safety nets and keep a certain way of life, then that is, generational wealth that's extended, that is political favor that's extended, that is authority and power that's extended. And that is nothing that those folks are willing to hand over without a fight, and without a dirty fight at that. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that, what Gary has come to learn through his previous experiences is that you can come with data, you can come with facts, you can come with, truisms, you can come with statistics. But if you're not willing to engage a little bit in the circus, then it's just going to pass you by. Yeah. So I think that's what it was.
Yeah. Go ahead, sister.
No, I was going to say, so to that end, and in the spirit of our time, we're going to do a little rapid fire there on some topics that are related to this. Because, you said, as we think about Louisiana politics, well, truthfully, I think if we look at all of the United States politics, it's pretty much a circus at this point. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of theater that's going on with a lot of bills. So one of them here in Florida, the Stop Woke bill.
You know what? Let me just say this. I am not a poet, but I do like subject verb agreement. I do like stuff that makes sense. What is stop woke? That just sounds stupid. Okay.
Well, nonetheless, so we know what it's about. And, I posted something yesterday based on the kind of conversation my sister and I have about, well, maybe Black people and maybe our Indigenous brothers and sisters, maybe our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, maybe we need to start suing when history lessons hurt our feelings, or when we feel ashamed, or we're made to feel bad about history in some way, shape, or form. But what's your thoughts on not just Florida's Stop Woke bill, because there are other bills in other states that have similar, that where you're in Maryland, but in Virginia, that was largely why the Virginia governor won,
Mhm.
around education and really teaching the true history of this country. I'm not even gonna call it how they tried to label, like they tried to take the woke. They've tried to co-opt critical race theory as well.
Yeah, so it's a misrepresentation, and a lot of this crusade began in August of 2019 when the 1619 Project came out. A lot of this has been a personal crusade, I think, against Nicole Hannah Jones, and then it just kind of rippled out from there. Um, the reality of the situation is, when you're talking about America in the post George Floyd era, where a bunch of people, black, white, brown, indigenous, and otherwise, came together to mobilize and rally on behalf of Black lives. What that did was completely, it really just kind of like disrupted the status quo so much, and it forced a lot of conversations, many of which being historical, to where these folks are legitimately concerned about the benevolence of whiteness being threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you have been able to teach generations of white children that it was the labor of their ancestors and the grit and the ingenuity of their ancestors that made this country what it is, and you have this counter narrative that says, wait, hold on, that's not exactly the full story, or that's not the truth, then there is this fear of having, whatever level of exceptionalism they believe they have in their mind be dismantled. So this is not about hurting white children's feelings as much as it is about dismantling this exceptionalism myth of all of what white folks have contributed to the country, right? That's not to say that, there has been no white contributions, of course, right? But it is to say that if you have children learning about how so many things that were foundational came upon the labor, the unpaid terroristic labor of, the transatlantic slave trade and the years that, followed it, then you are having a possibility of white children like reevaluate their relationship to privilege, nationalism, and supremacy. And so when you're talking about like a clown like Ron DeSantis, right, who, when running against Andrew Gillum in 2018, said, "Hey, Florida, let's not monkey this up." You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? You're talking about, politicians who are basically like the byproduct of an old guard or an old regime that tells you to hold on to the benevolence of whiteness by any means.
Yeah.
So that is a matter of not wanting white children to learn about anything outside of the myth of white exceptionalism.
Yeah. I think that is very true, but I also want us to stop talking about the distance of this, because it's not that distance.
Right.
It's actually not wanting you to know that your grandfather or your great grandfather, who I love so much, was out there yelling to keep the Little Rock Nine
Yeah.
from entering school, or to keep Ruby Bridges for entering school, or even in the 70s trying to keep the schools in Boston from being integrated. That
Hmm.
actually the grandmother and grandfather who you so revere, who is not that far from you.
Yeah. Now, there's a concern of white children looking in a history book and seeing familiar faces.
Yes.
Like, oh, that looks like my great aunt who's out there with that sign, um, trying to stop Ruby Bridges or the Little Rock Nine.
Yes.
So yeah, no, it definitely is that, which is why you get this language of we don't want white children to feel bad about themselves.
Right.
you know.
Exactly.
So
And
no, it's absolutely that.
well, continuing on that thread, one Mitch McConnell, as we said about the the not so slip of the tongue, saying, African American voting is as high as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And we asked that question. Well, in the spirit of our sister, ain't I a woman? Ain't our Sojourner Truth, but
Yeah.
ain't we American?
Absolutely. And so every now and then, those who traffic in low level racism or high level racism or conservative politics, they often throw these kind of nods or these innuendos, these winks, right? So if we think back to Donald Trump saying stand back and stand by
Mm-hmm.
on a political debate stage, and months later, you have an insurrection. Like I believe that was a connected idea, right? And at the time, people were like, "Who is he saying stand back and stand by to?" Oh, we asked him if he was denouncing QAnon and the Proud Boys and the Klan. He wouldn't do so. He said stand back and stand by. I think similarly, what you saw with Mitch McConnell when he said, African Americans are voting at the same, rate as Americans, that was also a wink. There was also a nod. And whether, his defenders are like, well, it was implied that, he's talking about all Americans or it was a slip of the tongue. No, it was a very intentional distinction. And the reason why that distinction was made was to minimize efforts or to block legislation that would, do away with voter suppression. So he's like, no, don't trip. The blacks are also showing up in record numbers, so they can't be suppressed. They're voting just like other Americans. No, they're voting just like regular Americans, right? And so there's an intentional distinction being made. Um, Mitch McConnell is like 1,000 years old. He's been in the Senate like forever, right? He understands language. He understands the nuance of phrasing. So I'm not of the belief that he accidentally made a distinction between African Americans and voting. What he's trying to say is there is no need for voting rights legislation because black people are showing up to the polls, even though we have seen polling places close. We have seen all type of voting restrictions where people are not allowed to be given water or food. We've seen a multitude of things that have directly impacted black voters. But what he's trying to pass off is this idea that uh, there's no peril with the black vote. The black vote is not in danger. They're voting just like everybody else.
Right. It's not that bad. Just like, slavery wasn't that bad, especially for certain people. I think one of the things that I immediately did after I heard that comment, because, again, I live in the state of Arizona, although, Louisiana is always home. And Kirsten Sinema has been a thorn in our side. But at the same time, I don't know that we should necessarily be giving her or Joe Manchin as much power as they've been given when it comes to this conversation about voting rights. The fact that we even have to have a conversation about voting rights in 2022 is deeply problematic for me because I feel like people forget that it is not just Black people who have had to fight for this right. It is also women. It is also Indigenous people. It is also LGBTQ plus people. People have been fighting for the right to vote, the right to marry, the right to do all sorts of things for generations. And so I immediately was like, what is so bad, right, about what is being asked. And so I put this article to NPR, and I know some people will say NPR is biased, but it was okay. So there's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which basically, because of all that was undone by the Supreme Court in 2013, would try to replace or restore those requirements for Southern states that at the end of the day are still showing a lot of Jim Crow era, post-Reconstruction era racism in terms of the way we are treated when it's time to vote. And then the Freedom to Vote Act. So what would it do? Okay, make Election Day a national holiday. I honestly don't know why it's not a national holiday at this point. Mm-hmm. Allow states to have early voting for at least 2 weeks prior to Election Day, including nights and weekends. Again, standardization just does not seem like this big, difficult, challenging thing when we're talking about federal elections. Allow voting by mail with no excuses needed. Voters can put their ballots in drop boxes. Require that states make voting more accessible for people with disabilities. Like, again, doesn't seem like this is stuff that is just so egregious. And then finally, require that states require IDs for voting would require that states that require IDs for voting would have to broaden the types of identification acceptable. States would also have to offer same-day voting registration and online registration also to make it easier to register at places like the DMV. Like, for me, I'm still trying to understand. I think the frustration for me is, people who are making these decisions. So Kyrsten Sinema, I don't want to stop the filibuster because, we're all kumbaya, right? We're all friends. We should be working together. That's not how it's happening. Mitch McConnell, African Americans are voting just like Americans, right? The frustration for me is people who are making these decisions about this right are not the people who were subjected to poll taxes. They're not the people who were subjected to literacy tests. They're not the people who were subjected to the grandfather clause. That's the offense of it all. And when you say, you don't want multiple types of identification to be utilized, like, oh, it should just be your driver's license. Why? We don't.
Everybody doesn't drive.
Everybody doesn't drive it. At some point, some older people, I'm sorry, but you have to take their driver's license. So why would they have one? Why would they keep renewing that if they no longer drive? So it's just frustrating because you're like, what, for me at least, what is the big deal? What is the problem? And you realize, at least from where I sit, there's nothing wrong with any of this legislation. So
if you impart enough restrictions that generally is, opposition to certain groups of people, then you're going to get the outcome that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. So if you're setting up, voting laws that, ultimately will be most beneficial to able-bodied, cisgender white males, then that's the vote that you're going to get.
Yeah.
I think that even when you talk about the whole idea of election being a federal holiday, right? One thing that we learned through the pandemic is just how many Black and brown people make up the service industry as far as like working and the hourly wage, right? So when you talk about Election Day as a federal holiday, you're talking about the ability of multiple employees potentially to be able to be off from work to go vote, which right now, if I don't work, if I don't have a salary, or if I don't own a company, if I don't have a certain level of, either vacation time or, leave time, I can't just leave my job post to go vote. I mean, I can, but there's, a potential for reprimand or punishment. And so again, if you look at what the workforce looks like in that capacity, who is being locked out of the ability to vote if they can't get off work to go?
Right.
So, like, for me, so much of what goes on continuously is foundational, and I often go back to who American politics initially were designed for, land owning white men, and there's been a an innumerable amount of strides that have been made over the generations and over the decades, but these folks have played the long game for a long time. And, whenever there is a surge toward some sort of progression, there's, some level of pushback.
Yeah.
I think about how at this point we are nearly 60 years from the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we're still talking about voting rights. So for me, it never is an issue of where we are in the continuum of time if there's not a dismantling of foundational things.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this time has gone by way, way too fast, and we definitely will have to have you back on to talk about more of these topics. This is the Twitter handle. Is it
Yep,
this correct?
yep, that's
And,
it. At
and
D-Rose225.
this is the website. Y'all
Yep.
go check out Donney Rose. Read more of his writings. Learn more about some of the projects he's worked on. Learn more about his poetry and how he's using his pen to be an activist and to be a voice to the voiceless and speak truth to power. We all have that ability and capability. Some of us are more talented at it than others. So we thank you for sharing your gift with us all. And that, with that being said, we're going to sign off for tonight. Any key takeaways from tonight, sister, or you something you want to say in closing?
I just want to say thank you so much, Donney, for being here. This has been an honor. And I would just lastly say, yeah, again, as I tweeted out the other day, if we don't have the right to vote, we can't serve on juries. And as I am, or we can't be jurors. And as I have been watching women of the movement, not that we even had that opportunity back then, but as we continue to see some of our own children be slaughtered and face unfair, punishment for things like marijuana, what have you. If we're not able to sit on the jury and be a voice for them in that deliberation room, then what will that look like for the future? So this Voting Rights Act is conversation is very important. So I encourage everybody to get involved.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, Donney, you hold the line. We're gonna wave bye to everybody and say good night, everybody.
Good night.